Today on In Good Faith, it's our quarterly book club edition, and here's a book from an author I've been hoping we would get to, C.S. Lewis, great Christian apologist as well as a fiction writer. And this particular book, I don't know if I dare say I'm happy about talking about a grief observed, but I am. It's not a long book, but it's really jam-packed with great information. Our producer for the episode is in studio today, Ashton Rowan. Thanks, Ashton.
Of course. Good to be here with you, Steve.
Also with us today is Dr. Paul Westover, who's been on the BYU faculty since 2008 in the English department. His specialty is Romantic-era British literature and cultural history, and his first book, Necromanticism, Traveling to Meet the Dead. And he's the co-editor of the Romantic Circle's electronic critical edition of William Wordsworth's Guide to the Lakes, and of a volume called Transatlantic Literature and Author-Love in the 19th Century. Also with us is a student from the C.S. Lewis class taught by Dr. Westover, Ruth Thomas, a senior majoring in computer science from Orem, Utah. Ruth, thank you for being here.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for having me.
So you're teaching a whole class, Paul, about C.S. Lewis, and tell me what the tack is and how this A Grief Observed fits in, and then we'll dive into the book.
Well, the unromantic and rambling answer to the question is that in crafting a Lewis course, of course, I wanted to get a sense for all of the genres in which he wrote.
Yeah.
Or if not in all those that would be really interesting to the audience that we have. So we read chiefly fiction and essays and Christian apologetics. And we're also trying to get a sense of the range of his work across his career. And A Grief Observed is quite late, published just a couple of years before his death. So it was a nice way to end the class. But it's a book in many ways that encapsulates things that he'd been thinking about and writing about for many years. One of the things that struck us, we discussed this book in class just yesterday, so this is fresh for us. One of the things that struck us was that, in a sense, as he writes this book, which, as I'm sure we'll discuss in a minute, is essentially a grief journal that he wrote after his wife passed away, he was working through things that he had been talking about in his books for decades. And in a sense, he's trying to read back his own rationalization of the problem of pain and suffering in the world in a way that can make sense to him now in the face of a shattering experience. So it's a book that is an echo chamber for lots of things in his life and lots of things in his other books.
Yeah, I'm fascinated. There was one point he had written I would call it yelling at God, being very unhappy with God. And then the next paragraph says, it's the next morning. I'm looking back, and even that next day, he's analyzing what he wrote and what he meant by being mad at God. And I think it's so interesting that here he is known as an apologist, and as you said, had written on these subjects, but he really does express that it's one thing to see someone get hit by a train. It's another when the train hits you.
Yeah.
That's not a quote from him, but that's what I got from what he's saying.
Yeah. A lot of people see this book almost as a sequel to a book he wrote 20 years earlier called The Problem of Pain. And I brought it with me because a passage from it has been rattling around in my mind. This is from Lewis's preface. I must add, too, that the only purpose of the book is to solve the intellectual problem raised by suffering. For the far higher task of teaching fortitude and patience, I was never fool enough to suppose myself qualified. Nor have I anything to offer my readers, except my conviction that when pain is to be borne, a little courage helps more than much knowledge, a little human sympathy more than much courage, and the least tincture of the love of God more than all. So at that time, it really was his attempt to frame the problem of suffering and loss in the world in terms that made intellectual sense. To be able to say that one can, with intellectual integrity, hold the Christian position in the face of all of the tough things that happen in life. But I love how he says this is merely about the intellectual problem.
Yes.
So when he comes back and writes the other book, then it's the experiential problem. As now he's thrown into the middle of all these things he's written about, and he has to see if he really believes them or not.
And I don't know if it makes any difference that he wasn't married for 60 years and then she passed away, but he did marry later in life. And it was this, it seems like, incredible pairing of intellect and interest and humor and all of the things that could make a great relationship. And that he got it late in life and then lost it. I don't know, in some ways, did that seem unfair to him, do you think?
Well, certainly there was a sense of having had this feast laid out on the table only to have it be snatched away,
Yeah.
as he put it. And when he married Joy, she was already very sick. She had terminal cancer. Both of them knew it. And so we have his letters from this period in which he tells people that great beauty and great tragedy have entered his life at the same moment. So he knows the clock is ticking.
Yeah, from the beginning.
From the beginning. But that doesn't make it any less devastating when she finally passes away.
You mentioned that this book you thought was a good one to end with in your college class. When you start talking about this, some people would say, well, this is a class full of very intelligent young people, but there's this assumption that young people haven't been through great tragedy, but that is not always the case.
No, it's nonsense. And I'd actually rather hear Ruth talk about this than hear myself. But it seemed clear as we talked about it in class yesterday that there were elements of the book that hit very close to home.
So you felt this from your classmates too, that they had really latched on or related to stuff here?
Yeah, I definitely think that, like you said, it's nonsense to think that young people haven't gone through something like this, because you never really know what somebody else has gone through.
Right.
And I think that it was definitely palpable, the feeling in the room of like the connection that we had to this, that we were thoughtful in a different way when talking about this. But it was different to how we analyzed his fiction, because we had a lot more of a personal connection to it.
Yeah, I could picture that everyone in the class cannot help but read his experience, but they're bringing their own personal one to it.
Absolutely. I found that this book felt very true to my personal experience with pain and grief. I could see a lot of lines that he wrote where I could say, oh yeah, I've been in that place. I've felt that thing. There's a particular line that I've been thinking about since I read it. It says, "You tell me," she goes on, "but my heart and body are crying out, come back, come back. I know that the thing I want is exactly the thing I can never get. The old life, the jokes, the drinks, the arguments, the lovemaking, the tiny heartbreaking commonplace." And the phrase, the tiny heartbreaking commonplace, just really got me, because I think that's how it is a lot of the time. It's all of the ordinary things that you didn't realize that you connected with the person that you've lost until they're gone. And then it's candy or a sweater or something like that that brings them back.
Yeah. And I believe it was his stepson writing in the introduction to the edition I have, where he talks about, it should be noted that this is not grief observed, it's a grief observed, a very specific occasion of grief. And yet, I'm impressed that it was so universal in the class.
After hearing Ruth say that, I also want to talk about the tiny heartbreaking commonplace, and I feel like this is something that's often talked about when people discuss grief and bereavement is, there's these big events, but what they really miss the most, and I've experienced this myself, and I've heard others talk about it, is just the everyday and the tiny commonplace moments. But I think that from this book, and coming from a faith perspective, it has a little tie-in where I think a lot of people talk about faith this way as well, where anybody can believe in God and believe in the divine and feel spiritual in these big moments, these moments of large emotion, turmoil, happiness, joy, whatever it may be. Some of the times when people can feel God and the divine and spirituality. But much like this grief and much like real rooted faith, I feel that people often tell us in our other standard interviews on this show how much they find the divine in these commonplace moments and how that means the most, much like this grief. And another thing that I just wanted to bring up before we kind of dive deeper into the book was just the overarching sense for me, as Dr. Westover was saying earlier, that it's defined a lot as a wrestle. And it certainly is just a wrestle with God. But I think the wrestle is between moments of intellectual belief and moments of experiential belief that he has to grapple with, and how anybody can believe in God in these moments of happiness and moments of where they feel they're blessed. And he feels like that was easy enough for him. But when he really came to grapple with it, with his faith, with who he thought God was, that only came in moments of intense turmoil.
Do you know, Paul, if he hesitated to release this because it was so personal and because he was so thought of as so solid in the faith and as someone you rely on when you have questions?
My impression is that he was not reluctant to release it. He thought it might be helpful to others, and he really didn't hesitate very long. Joy died in the middle of July. He immediately began filling notebooks with his reflections on grief. By late September, he had already sent off the manuscript to Faber and Faber in London. However, he sent it by way of an agent, and he set it under a pen name. So I do think that
N.W. Clerk. I think.
Is kind of a scholarly in-joke. N.W. meaning not whilk, which is Anglo-Saxon for I know not which. Clark meaning somebody who's a scholar who can read and write. So it literally means the anonymous scholar or the unknown scholar. So I do think he wanted there to be some distance between this very raw meditation on grief and his more formal works. After he died, it was republished under his own name. Of course, there was no reason for the privacy, but I do think he didn't want his fame and his reputation to get in the way of readers. All of his motivations are certainly open to speculation.
It is so, I want to say, refreshing to have him just say, here are these questions, and here are the things that I was really mad about, and here are the despairs that I had. He says, I'm reading on page 27 of my edition, that people are saying that she's fine because she is in God's hands. But if so, she was in God's hands all the time. And I've seen what they did to her here. So do they suddenly become gentler to us the moment we're out of the body? And if so, why? If God's goodness is inconsistent with hurting us, then either God is not good or there is no God, for in the only life we know, he hurts us beyond our worst fears and beyond all we can imagine. Now, this is someone in the depths and not considering the good things in their life, but certainly recognizing, well, we say they're in God's hands, but aren't we all in God's hands all the time? And look how well it's going.
I think that there's an interesting moment this later in the book on page 63. This was something I highlighted because it really stuck out to me, where he talked about her being in God's hands, is where he kind of quotes people saying him to this, she's in God's hands. And he says it in a tone that you feel like he hears this all the time. And then he says, that gains a new energy when I think of her as a sword. Perhaps the earthly life I shared with her was only part of the tempering. Now perhaps he grasps the hilts, weighs the new weapon, makes lightnings with it in the air, a right Jerusalem blade. And I thought this part kind of made me chuckle a little bit, because when people come up to him and say, oh, she's in God's hands, and then he thinks of her as this sword being grasped by God's literal hands. And I thought there was a lot of different directions and ways in which this could be both kind of comforting and also in some ways lighthearted, in some ways very profound. But just that he feels, of course, it kind of made me think of him knowing his wife and thinking that now she's this fierce sword in the hands of God that's able to accomplish what he wants to accomplish. And it also made me think of him kind of accepting that she was always more God's than she was his. I was wondering if anybody else has thoughts on that.
Well, I have a thought, but it might draw us away from where we were talking.
This is book club.
So back a couple pages, and by a couple I mean 20, is the part where he starts talking about her, like comparing her to a sword in the first place.
Yeah.
And I really liked that comparison. I think this is probably going to be rambly because my thoughts are going all over the place now. I think that it's beautiful to see Lewis's style and his way with words cutting through all of the, because it's clearly his style, but it's a lot messier. A lot rawer, I guess, is a better description than a lot of his other works. But I think that it's beautiful that you can still see the essence of that in his brilliant way of describing people and letting you understand them. But I think the thing that I started out going for was a couple of lines after that, where it says that her soul was straight, bright, and tempered like a sword. He said, I know there are not only tears to be dried, but stains to be scoured. The sword will be made even brighter. And he goes on to talk about a theme that he kind of has drawn throughout the book, which is the idea of God as a cosmic sadist, which was one that I found particularly interesting. He made a couple of different comparisons there. One of them was, he talked about like a cat going to the vet and how she doesn't know that the vet is intending to help her be better, right? She can't tell the difference between a vet and a vivisector.
Yes.
And how that's sometimes where we're at with God. And in this particular spot...
Because all we see is the knife.
Yes, exactly.
Coming towards us.
Yeah. In this particular spot, he says, the terrible thing is that a perfectly good God is in this matter hardly less formidable than a cosmic sadist. The more we believe that God hurts only to heal, the less we can believe that there is any use in begging for tenderness. And I just find that really interesting, along with the line later where he says, what do people mean when they say, I am not afraid of God because I know he is good? Have they never been to a dentist? And I think that it's...
I wrote that exact line here. The drills on,
yes,
no matter.
Exactly.
And again, it's a theme that he's been talking about in his books for years, right? If God truly loves us, that's more than his being kindly disposed toward us. That's more than being like a grandfather in heaven who says, I hope all the children had a good time. If he truly pays us what he calls the intolerable compliment of loving us, that means he loves us too much to leave us as we are. And that means we're in for the full treatment. And you'd better count the cost if you're going to become a Christian. Because if you let him, he will transform you. And it's absolutely worth it. And joy is on the other side. But that doesn't mean it doesn't hurt. And it seems to me that is one of the keen insights of this book. Again, he's really in the middle of the hurt to the point that he just doesn't know if he can take it.
You use that word transformation. And those are times in our life when we feel grief. Our physical state of health has changed. Or like him, we've lost someone. We lose a job. We have to move to a new place. Just any number of things. I hope I didn't interrupt you there.
No.
But I love that you use that transformation and that those can be times of grief because we've lost something we had and we don't always see what we're on the way to.
Yeah, I thought a place on the book where he ruminates on this concept really articulately in a way that I thought was very powerful was on page 48. He starts by saying, it was too perfect to last, so I am tempted to say of our marriage. But that can be meant in two ways. It may be grimly pessimistic, as if God no sooner saw two of his creatures happy than he stopped it. As if he were like the hostess at the sherry party who separates two guests the moment they show signs of having got into a real conversation. But it could also mean this had reached its proper perfection. This had become what it had in it to be. Therefore, of course, it would not be prolonged. As if God said, good, you have mastered that exercise. I am very pleased with it. And now you are ready to go on to the next. When you have learned to do quadratics and enjoy doing them, you will not beset them much longer. The teacher moves you on. And I thought this was a really kind of fresh look at this, at his own grief and in many of the problems that we have in life, and that if we know God is good and yet he makes he allows all this pain, and he allowed Lewis to feel all of the longing and the terrible turmoil that he felt. I thought it was really interesting for him to be able to look at this and say, well, I had already, maybe we had just were good enough at it. And God said, that's okay. Like, you did it. It's time to be able to move on and teach new lessons.
I'm wondering, this book, well, one thing I heard was that he knew the book had hit a vein when people kept sending it to him.
Yeah.
Like, this might help you. There's someone in a similar situation. And I guess, I don't know, you would know, but I guess he had to just smile and say, well, thank you. What could he say?
No, it's true. And the circle of people who knew who the author was initially was pretty tight, to the point that he had a friend whose wife was grieving the loss of her dad. And Lewis gave him a copy of the book and said, it is by a man I know. His friend immediately knew what he meant. But yeah, it did clearly strike a chord with people. And I think what you said earlier about the title was really important. If this had been like many of his other books, it would have been called Grief Observed, not A Grief Observed. But by making it so particular and so intimate, on the one hand, I imagine it lets people get a little bit of a distance from it, because they can say, well, my experience matches his in these ways, but maybe not in these others. But by the same token, it allows you to insert yourself in that story. And I think for some people that was great, because as he himself says in the book, grief doesn't need a map, it needs a history.
Interesting.
And so for people to be able to insert themselves then in the story as it unfolds, the day-to-day moments of hope and setbacks and anger and denial and all the things you go to in grief, I think that was what made the book really powerful and then really portable.
Because it seems like it gives us a tiny bit of distance, that he's not saying, when you experience horrible things, here are the following steps for dealing with that. He just throws that all out the window and just shares what he is going through. What else do you love about this book? Why do you like including it?
I don't know where to begin answering that question. The first thought that popped into my mind is that, in a sense, it's a recantation of his. In his memoir that he had published a few years before, he mentioned that when he converted to theism, for a long time he was an atheist. And when he converted, he said he had given up the time-wasting practice of keeping a journal. He thought that it made him morbidly self-conscious, and that anyway, when one writes a journal, one never captures what really matters. But all of a sudden, in this moment, ink was the only medicine. He said, I need some kind of drug, and reading isn't strong enough right now. And so he did what he had always done. He took to the pen. And the fact that the writing process and the grieving process overlapped in such a great way makes it great in a literature class, because it's life meeting form. It's a way of making all of these theological conversations that we've had all semester be felt along the bones and in the pulses. And so in a way, we're mirroring the process that he's talking about in the book by ending our semester this way.
I think along that line of ending the class with that, and his experiences with grief, one thing that stood out to me was in the last chapter when he talks about, he says, this is my last notebook, and I'm not going to allow myself to get another notebook and keep writing on this. I thought that was so powerful, and also just for the readers, for his own grief, to say, you have to move on. There has to be endings. Endings are what make life meaningful. Endings are required in everything. And for him to just say, I'm not going to let myself get another notebook, and I'm going to say what I feel, and that will be that. I thought that was very powerful.
Yeah, he never tells us how much time has passed. But we know, reconstructing, that he writes the whole thing in just 2 or 3 months. And it would have been a very different book had he continued it over the course of a year or over the course of 3 years. But maybe the concentration of it is part of its value to us.
Yeah.
You're listening to In Good Faith. This is our quarterly book club edition, and we're talking about a book by C.S. Lewis, A Grief Observed. We'll be back in just a moment. You know, there are no perfect people, and there are no perfect families, and no perfect relationships. So how do we be good people and have good relationships and good families? How do we do better at what is most important to us? I'm here to tell you about The Lisa Show, another in the family of BYU radio podcasts. Lisa Valentine Clark is a comedian, a believer, a single mother. She delves into the challenges and the relationships that shape all of our lives, whether we're talking about parenting, mental health questions, social issues, being a caregiver. She and her council of moms tackle the topic. Yes, you'll hear from experts, but you'll also hear from the people who have been digging the trenches. She'll help you figure out this thing called life, with lots of laughs along the way. It's The Lisa Show. Listen wherever you get your podcasts. This is In Good Faith. We're back talking about A Grief Observed by C.S. Lewis. I'm wondering about the idea on page 62 for me. He's looking at these notebooks, and he says, the notes have been about myself and about H, as he calls his wife, and about God, in that order. The order and the proportions exactly what they ought not to have been. Like, I shouldn't have been just writing about me and then a little about my wife and even less about God. But all he has is himself and his mind in his own body. So I don't know what else he could have done, especially when he's in this moment of intense grief. I see that I have nowhere fallen into that mode of thinking about either, which we call praising them, yet that would have been best. Praise is the mode of love which always has some element of joy in it. He's not at a joyful time. He can't really write about that. So it's interesting. So he does what he can do. He writes about himself in reference to his wife and to God.
Yeah. But light does start coming back through the window when he's not endlessly circling on his own pain. But when he begins to turn outward, and whether that's taking interest just in his daily work or in other people, or in giving praise, or pouring himself into a piece of writing, right? He realizes that that's very helpful, and it shouldn't have been surprising to him in the least, because again, this has been a theme of his book his entire life, and he understands you have to sort of lose your life in order to find it, and get over yourself in order to find yourself. But he's rediscovering this now, in the furnace of affliction, and it's kind of nice to see how these moments of if not joy and comfort, alleviation start coming in and almost taking him by surprise.
Something that would maybe be interesting to note is, so not just before this one, but the book before that, we read out of Surprised by Joy, which is another of his books. And the way that he describes joy is almost like a longing for something more. And I think that putting that in combination with what we've read right here, I'm not sure that I have the words to describe what I want to say. But I really like thinking of those in combination, that praise is the mode of love, which always has some element of joy in it, of that longing.
You feel that?
Yeah. Yeah.
Tell me what else, Ruth. What else was really valuable to you or caught your attention?
Let's see.
I realize I'm making you leaf through the book. It's not the copy
Not
that
the
you
one
were.
One thing that made me laugh is on pages 48 and 49. He was talking about his relationship with his wife in comparison with other relationships that he'd had. And on page 48, he says, I once praised her for her masculine virtues, but she soon put a stop to that by asking how I'd like to be praised for my feminine ones. And then on the next page, it says, it is arrogance in us to call frankness, fairness, and chivalry masculine when we see them in a woman. It is arrogance in them to describe a man's sensitiveness or tact or tenderness as feminine. In the image of God created he them. Thus, by a paradox, this carnival of sexuality leads us out beyond our sexes. That doesn't really relate to a lot of what we've been talking about today, but it is something that caught my eye that I found quite interesting. And I like that it's a point that he makes, especially because we talked in class about how he wasn't really great at writing female characters. And I think that this is an interesting progression in his understanding of people in general. And I like that it's something that he felt was significant enough to include.
Yeah, he talks about really learning something there.
Yeah.
Realizing something.
He's become a different, more complete person because of his marriage. He says at one point that he caught himself, I believe it was just walking along at university and enjoying nature, and he realized that he was enjoying himself in a way that he'd always enjoyed himself for years as a single person. And that struck him with a pain because he said, I don't want to go back to being happy in that old way, as if my relationship with my wife never happened. Right? And so part of what he's grappling with is how do I move forward, right, as the more refined, more complete person that she's made me.
When he very first decides, what do I do now? And then he thinks, well, I kind of want to be alone. He talks about this impulse to be alone, but he decided to make himself go to the pub where they had gone and enjoyed themselves and had friends and go to these different places. And he realized, I'm not suffering more when I'm there than I am when I'm alone, so I may as well go. But it was really clear to him that we as human beings often have trouble with other people's grief. That he could see people as they were coming towards him on the street, their face would change, and he could tell they were formulating, do I bring it up? Do I not? Yeah. Do I ask how he is? No, because then he might tell me. He's just
and we've
so...
all been there. We've all been there.
Yes. So he's just so observant of that. And it made me also have a bit of compassion and grace for the people who don't know what to do, mostly because they want to be helpful, but they don't know what will be. Is it better for me to ask what team he's cheering for, or better to say, how are you doing since your wife died?
Yeah. And he's frank. He says, it kind of bothers me whichever thing they do.
Yeah, either way.
It pains me when they bring it up, but it's also kind of irksome when they won't bring it up. I was trying to find the passage. I don't remember the page number, but he says, I sort of like the young men who come up with red cheeks, clearly slightly embarrassed, and say, so sorry, old man, and get it over.
Get it over with. They've broken the ice.
Yeah, he can have compassion for them, because he doesn't always want to talk about it, and yet he says, I don't want to be alone. Mm-hmm. The best would be to be in company and have everyone else be enjoying a great conversation and just be able to be there with them.
Because he's written so much about Christianity, is there someplace in this book where you feel like he really addresses that specifically, or is it more just him and God in general, that relationship?
Well, I'd love to hear everyone's answer to that question. I was thinking about the nature of faith in the book, given the title of this podcast, In Good Faith. Of course, it was something, again, that he'd written about in his famous work, Mere Christianity, which, as many listeners will know, began as a series of radio talks that he gave during World War II. He has 2 chapters on faith, and he proposes that there are 2 aspects to faith that one ought to keep in mind. One of them, he defines it as the art of holding on to things your reason has once accepted in spite of your changing moods. This is the idea that once we accept something as true means that we're always going to feel it. We're always going to be full of conviction and passion and inspiration. He says it's just not true to human experience. So you have to be able to hold on even when the emotional storm comes. Well, this book clearly is a great test to that kind of faith, which he calls faith number 1. The second kind of faith, he says, is trusting in God and in the redemption of Christ in the face of one's own bankruptcy. In other words, when you get to the point when you've tried very hard to be good and to be fully Christian and virtuous and so on, and realized that under your own steam, you're never going to manage it, right? That's when Christianity really begins to talk. And I see that playing out in this book as well, right? The surrender. You know, first it kind of is an intellectual problem. Can I hold on to my belief? He says, I think I can. There's no real danger of me stopping to believe in God, even though right now I may be believing horrible things about him, right? He says, there's no real danger of that. I think I can hold on. But again, this deeper level of saying, okay, how do I then turn over my grief and make that part of the consecration of myself and make a part of the surrender I need to make to God and trust in him that he's going to make this all right. That seems to me the journey. There are moments in the book when he thinks, gosh, I don't know where my faith is. It's been knocked over like a house of cards, right? He says.
Yeah.
In the end, he realizes.
And then he said, and if I build it up again, is it just another house of cards to get knocked down by the next disaster?
Correct. But if so, the sooner it's knocked down, the better. He says, right? Because if
he's quoting her, I think.
Well, he said this is what
similar.
she would say.
Yeah,
right? Because what you need to do is be able to take reality. And if you haven't accepted reality yet, then God needs to knock it down.
Oh boy, I'm in trouble.
Yeah. No, how much reality can any human being really take? I mean, that's part of the question of the book. But faith is being willing to say, well, if I'm not there yet, then shake me up and show me where I'm lacking.
You're listening to In Good Faith, a book club edition discussing C.S. Lewis's book, A Grief Observed. We'll be back in a moment. I'm Stephen Kapp Perry, host of the In Good Faith podcast, and I want to tell you about another in our family of BYU radio podcasts, an award-winning show with an award-winning host. This is Julie Rose on Top of Mind. Do you get turned off by the news because of how angry and polarizing and even depressing it can be? Doesn't anybody know how to have a civil conversation or weigh two competing ideas without a knee-jerk reaction that if you don't think what I think, you're a bad person? Check out the podcast, Top of Mind. They take one tough topic and they dive deep. And the goal is learning how to stay open and curious, even when you're confronted with different perspectives that may challenge us. Learning how to stick with the discomfort until we feel like we've actually learned and gotten some understanding. We may change our minds, we may not, but every episode will leave you feeling hopeful and empowered to become a better advocate for what does matter to you. Top of Mind, listen to the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. This is In Good Faith. We're back talking about A Grief Observed by C.S. Lewis.
One of the things that stuck out to me about the book was, in some ways, the absence of Christ in his ruminations and in his feelings. And obviously, he's one of the most famous Christian apologists of all time. And yet, in this book, I felt that Jesus was so absent. And I think what that speaks to is, was it being easy for him to think about the atonement of Christ and resurrection and redemption and all of these core principles of Christian belief? And then when he was thrust into the fire like this, and he was in this wrestle, that became so much harder for him to think about and to deal with. And I think for me, that's kind of why Christ didn't come up in this book much.
I think a little bit along those lines. I'm not sure where to find it, but he talks about knocking and feeling like the door was not only slammed shut in his face, but also bolted closed.
Yeah, it's right at the beginning.
The part I'm actually looking for is when he comes back to that at the end somewhere, where he talks about how it's difficult to save someone who's drowning because of all of the thrashing and yelling and the panic.
Yes.
Oh, wow, you got it right here. It says, I have gradually been coming to feel that the door is no longer shut and bolted. Was it my own frantic need that slammed it in my face? That time when there is nothing at all in your soul except a cry for help may be just the time when God can't give it. You are like the drowning man who can't be helped because he clutches and grabs. Perhaps your own reiterated cries deafen you to the voice you hoped to hear. And I felt like that was one of the clearest references to Christianity. Of course, there's all of the other little allusions. But that felt really true to me. And I feel like looking back on experiences that I've had in the same way that he is right here, it's easy to say, oh, like, yeah, God was there with me. I just wasn't letting him let me in.
So with a work of fiction, we like to see the characters take a journey. And so here he's journaling, and I guess the easy answer would be say, let's flip to the end when he's worked it all out. I'm not sure that happens, but we do see recognitions like that. And I think if I remember the part where he's coming back to that, first he says, the door was slammed, I heard the deadbolt shut, and then there was silence. Like, I will not respond. But then later, I think he talks about sitting in that it was a special kind of a silence. And I think he used the phrase that stuck in my mind, companionable gaze, that he and God were sort of, I just pictured them knee to knee looking at each other, and God was not going to say anything because if I say anything, you're not in a place to understand it, but I'm here with you. And I don't know, that seemed like some sort of a change. And he questions himself. Page 68, he says, because he's seeking God still, he says, am I, for instance, just sidling back to God because I know that if there is any road to H, his wife, it runs through him? Like, am I just approaching God because, dang it, it's the only way to get back to her, so I guess I have to love God too?
And I know that God can't be made a means to an end.
Yes.
I understand it, but to seek God, to go to God is to then receive everything else thrown in. But at the same time, isn't that a little bit like saying to little boys, you can have some toffee as soon as you no longer want toffee?
Yeah, when you've grown up. Anything? Any other points you want to? You've got a whole class or two here, but I'd love it for you to pick out some of those for us.
There's so much. I'm struggling. I mentioned before we began today that I think it's almost a disadvantage that we just barely read this book and discussed it because I'm really in the weeds with it. After a couple of weeks, I'd be able to have some distance about what are the concepts you really want to abstract from the book. But the details are what stick out in your mind, the memorable phrases. One of them that I'm thinking of right now is his acknowledging that even though one can heal and move forward from grief, one is never the same. He says losing a spouse is like an amputation. You'll remember this passage. And he says, at present, I'm learning how to get around on crutches. And maybe someone will eventually give me a prosthetic leg. But I'm never going to be a biped again. I appreciate the realism of that. The fact that with grief, one never really completely gets over it. And on some level, one doesn't really want to completely get over it. Because that's another one of the powerful insights of the book.
Because it grows from the love.
Exactly. And it's part of the love. He says, when you get married, you know that one of you is going to go first. And this is an inevitable part of your marriage, every bit as much as the honeymoon. And so the question is, how do we live faithfully and lovingly through this stage, just as we did through the others? But you can't have the love without the grief. That's part of the deal.
Well, that whole idea of accepting reality, I'm trying to get better at that. But it is just a given that it will not be an easy thing. And to deny that grief would be to have lost the memory of the beloved. Like, I can't imagine he would say, this grief is so bad that I hope you take it away, even if it means that I won't even remember that I knew this person. No one would accept that. We'd take the grief.
Every time. Yeah, it's Alfred Lord Tennyson, right? And a poem that Lewis knew very well. It is better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all. And Tennyson in that poem actually says, I feel it most when my grief is the strongest, which is an interesting thing to say, that it was worth it. The pain is telling me how precious it was.
Did people, Ruth, in the college class, this course that you're talking about, were they, I mean, people were vulnerable. You mentioned tears as people discussed the ideas. Were people willing to share what their particular griefs had been, or was it more, I had something happen, or our family went through something? I don't know that it makes a difference, but I was just curious what this brought out to read and discuss together.
Yeah, to some extent. I think everybody's at a different place, but some people were able to. And that's something that I've noticed about this class that I've really liked is there have been times, not just with this book, but with all of the books that we've read, where people have been able to be quite vulnerable as they see themselves or an event in their lives in the way that Lewis talks about Christianity or its different aspects or in grief. And that's something that I really appreciate about both the class itself and the environment that we have, but also Lewis's work in general, because I think it in some ways makes you feel like it's safe to feel those things or to express those things.
Well, they say vulnerability breeds vulnerability. So since he is so open,
Yeah.
I wonder if that invites that. We're at a table of people who like to read books here. I've read probably 99% of the books I've read in my life on my own and thought about them as I was reading them, and a few stayed with me after. The whole idea of either a book club or a class where you get to share the reading experience, what is that more meaningful?
I don't know that I would say it's necessarily more meaningful, but I think that it's meaningful in a different way. Specifically because it gets you to think about things that other people thought about. So like, I guess I would say it's the same amount of meaningful to me as it would have been if I'd read the book on my own, but I get the added bonus of getting everybody, like the meaning that everybody else got from it, I guess. And sometimes I don't agree with the things that people say and I file that away. But there have been a lot of things that people have said where I went, oh, I didn't think about that. So I guess I have to amend and say in some ways maybe it is more meaningful because then it adds to the meaning that I got from it.
We've had some slightly rowdy debates.
That's true.
If nothing else, and it's an excuse to read the books. I didn't know who was going to show up for this class. I looked at my roll. I saw 35 students from 26 different majors.
Wow.
And I thought, who are these people? And of course, there are 35 different answers to that question. But I found that most of them hadn't read a ton of Lewis. Some have read maybe a few of the Narnia books, but most people had just heard about Lewis and they were curious and they wanted an excuse to read. And so taking the class was a way to get paid for eating ice cream. And I've loved that, just the enthusiasm with which people have tackled it and the sense of joy in discovering these books that I hope will be lifelong friends to the students. I took a very similar class back in the 1990s, and it changed my life. And when my colleague retired who used to teach the class, I thought someone's got to teach it. And that's the story of how I ended up being an English 236 C.S. Lewis.
So you get to come back and revisit these works, and with a different cast of characters. I'm talking about the class, not in the books. And so you could have a whole different experience with the same piece of writing.
Yeah, I'm surprised every day about what students are responding to, what puzzles them, what excites them. And that's fun. I never know what's going to happen. Yesterday was a perfect example. Ruth described how class went. I had created a pretty structured lesson plan, and I ended up not feeling good about it. I even shared it with the students at the end of class. I said, should I have done this rather than what we did?
That's pretty vulnerable.
But in the event, I just came in and said, hey, you guys know I'm going to be recording this podcast tomorrow. If you were going to be in a book club talking on the radio about this book, what would you talk about? And really, that was the only directive moment of teaching I had, right? From there, it was just a free-flowing conversation.
Yeah.
And a lot of the students said they liked that because in a way, our conversation mimicked the form of the book. Not so carefully structured and laid out, right? But it was just, what did that person's comment make me remember and feel? What did it remind me of? And so it was very organic. I can't decide if that was an example of good teaching, flexibility in the face of student feedback, or if it was an example of really bad teaching and poor planning. But I went away feeling like we had done something valuable, that people would remember the conversation.
I would agree.
And I feel like in many ways that is a better way to teach this book, because it's not a work of intense literature that needs to be unpacked by an academic and professor, needs to be taught. I think it's a book about human emotion. It's a book about what he feels and therefore in many ways what you feel. And I think that that's the most important part of this work, is that it's just about raw human experience.
Dr. Westover, some people will say, like if I hand them this book, they'll say, well, that doesn't sound very cheery, perhaps, or does it have a good ending? Those things don't seem to apply. What would you say to someone if you were handing them this book and wanted them to kind of have a good frame of mind to receive that? We're hoping people who listen to our book club discussions run right out or load it on their Kindle immediately.
I have handed it to people before. And I mentioned it to a friend just last night. Her husband is burying his father this weekend. I do think it has to be the right moment. A person has to come to it at a moment of being ready to work it through. For some people, I think when the grief is fresh, it might be too near, and it might be something that they want to read in a couple of months. But I think the point in it isn't to have a happy ending, although I actually think the ending is more affirmative than some people say. The purpose isn't to say there are pat answers. He says, if people want to talk to me about the truth of faith and the duties of faith, I'll listen to them as sympathetically as I ever did. But if people talk to me about the consolations of faith right now, I shall suspect that they don't understand. I think when we're grieving, we don't want people to give us happy platitudes. I think we want someone to sit with us in our grief. And that's what this book does. And so if you want a book that's companionate at a time that's difficult, I think it's a really great one to pick up.
You're looking for more of the connection to Christianity specifically. I would recommend reading Mere Christianity, because a lot of the things that he talks about in Mere Christianity, you can see reflected over the course of this book as he's grappling with the things that he has believed and trying to come to terms with those beliefs in the face of something so devastating. I definitely think that you can read this without having read that, and that it's still very powerful, and it still does a lot. But that reading his other books can definitely bring a lot to it as well.
We've been talking about A Grief Observed. It's actually a fairly short book by C.S. Lewis. I've been speaking with Dr. Paul Westover from the English department here at Brigham Young University, as well as Ruth Thomas from Orem, Utah, a senior majoring in computer science and with a minor in creative writing, and one of our In Good Faith producers, Ashton Rowan.